Man, songs can come from the strangest places. Coming up next, the story of a Hall of Fame rocker who found inspiration for the lyrics of his last big hit when he saw a lady in a pink uniform take a mad tumble on the ski slopes in Idaho. Now, at first he thought that this person might be seriously injured or even dead because she biffed it so hard. But when he came over to her, she took off her ski mask and he realized this pink lady was one of the biggest music legends ever. Later, the incident triggered the words for a song that he had shelved for years because he couldn't figure out what to call it, what to do with it. It's a song that brought us pop rock sorcery with a hook that's impossible to shake, with one of the longest words in the chorus of that time that most would find difficult to rhyme with, but it caught fire around the world. Even though the record label offered no support, and because they'd given up on this legend, they thought he was turning into a dinosaur. And in a strange turn of events, this number one hit didn't really move the needle for this guy, and he left music for 6 long years. Find out what happened after that on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you remember riding your bike around the neighborhood for hours on end with your friends back in the day without a care in the world, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. This is a time machine. Make sure to subscribe below, click the red bell, and click the notification button so you know when our stuff comes out. Check us out on Patreon, check out our merch below. You know, Steve Miller was a staple of 70s rock and pop, even into the 80s. He and the Steve Miller Band were one of the hottest acts in the business. They were selling out football stadiums. But when the 80s came, the band was suddenly yesterday's news. Even his own label had cooled on the future of the Steve Miller Band. Now, in 1981, while skiing in Idaho, Steve Miller witnessed a superstar wiping out on the slopes below him. The spill inspired the lyrics for a song to go with the music that he composed years ago. It had sat on the shelf for many years, gathering dust, because he just didn't know what to do with it. Couldn't think of what to write to it. So despite being written off by the press as an uncool dinosaur, Steve worked his magic in the studio, and with a little hocus pocus, Abracadabra came to life. The track shot him right back to the top of the charts and became one of his biggest hits. But what happened after that is even crazier. So Steve Miller is what I'd call a true purist, someone whose artistic integrity has always stood out. Steve's musical roots run deep. He's the godson of guitar innovator Les Paul, and he spent a lot of time backing up the legendary Chuck Berry. That kind of pedigree has made me respect his craft even more. Steve had a wild experience with Chuck Berry, someone he worshipped, as most musicians did that emerged in the 60s and 70s. Steve had a vivid memory of the first time that he played with Chuck Berry. It was one of the most surreal gigs of his entire career. He started his first band in 1956. Boz Scaggs was a member of that band that played every Friday and Saturday night. Now, they played a lot of Chuck Berry songs in their set, including Nadine and Memphis, Tennessee. Nadine, honey, is that you? Now, fast forward a decade into 1966, when Steve and his band had finally made a solid name for themselves in the vibrant San Francisco music scene. The powerful promoter, Bill Graham, tapped them to back up Chuck Berry at the famous venue, the Fillmore. The plan was to record the show for a live album in 1967. Steve would only agree to do this, though, if Chuck Berry actually rehearsed with his band. He didn't want, Berry to just show up, as he was infamous for doing a lot of times. So Chuck came out, he rehearsed with Steve and his band for like 2 days, and they learned to play every one of his songs exactly the way that Chuck wanted them to be played. It was all coming together perfectly, until a last-minute twist. Always, right? Just before they all went on stage, a guy from Mercury Records pulled Chuck aside. He actually pulled him outside of the venue. When he came back, Chuck Berry was totally stoned. Steve was amazed that in his altered state, though, Chuck played some incredible stuff. And they played 4 really weird yet beautiful sets. So funny, Steve said that Chuck looked like a gazelle on stage, moving with perfect balance and grace, even though he was stoned. It was the start of his big comeback. Steve Miller's wild ride with Chuck Berry was more than just a one-off, though. It actually spanned over 30 gigs with the rock and roll icon. Now, Chuck Berry had his own way of doing things, and Steve got a front row seat to this madness. It made him extremely anxious and very angry. Chuck would fly to a gig from St. Louis and arrive at the venue just a few minutes before he was supposed to go on stage with Steve and the band. It always gave the guys heart palpitations worrying about Chuck making it to the gig on time. And then there was Chuck Berry's demand to be paid in cash. Again, only moments before he was set to go on stage. If the fans wanted an encore, Chuck insisted on extra cash right on the spot. His antics put everyone related to producing the show on edge at all times. During many of their gigs, Chuck would stop the music in mid-performance because something upset him. It all came to a head, though, backstage after Chuck publicly humiliated the band on stage. Legend or not, Steve Miller had had enough. Backstage, an irate Steve confronted Chuck. He said, "If you ever do that to me again, Chuck, you can get your own band and equipment. We won't stand for this bullshit." After that showdown, Chuck never had another problem. He was professional, he was respectful, and he never created an ounce of drama from that point on. Steve Miller's kind of known for doing that. No holds barred, man. Like I said before, the Steve Miller Band was an A-list headliner act in the 70s. I mean, they were selling out arenas and football stadiums all together. But when the 80s started, the music landscape had changed. It was supercharged with punk and new wave and hard rock bands, metal bands. Steve Miller Band and the rest of the 70s was passé. Instead of playing in front of 20,000 or more, Steve found himself performing with only a few thousand in the house. It seemed like overnight he was pushed aside as irrelevant. He honestly thought his career was over. So he took a break to clear his head and he went skiing at a resort near his home in Sun Valley, Idaho. Let's pick back up on this story. While he was on the slopes, he saw someone wearing a pink satin snowsuit bite it, taking just a nasty spill. He went over to see if the skier was okay, and he discovered it was none other than Miss Ross, Diana Ross. "Holy crap, it's Diana Ross," is what he said to himself. Luckily, one of the most prolific singers of all time was okay. Probably more embarrassed than hurt. The accident, though, immediately sparked an idea for the lyrics to Abracadabra. After witnessing Diana Ross's crash and confirming that she was okay, Steve skied down the mountain and he went to have lunch. Started thinking about Diana Ross and the Supremes. Now, Steve first met Diana when they performed together on the Hullabaloo program on NBC TV back in '66. Then he reflected back on an unfinished song that he had been working on and off for about 3 years. He loved the musical arrangement for the foundation of the song, but he hated the original lyrics. He just couldn't get it right. That's why it was shelved. How would Diana Ross and the Supremes do this song, is what he was wondering. Now, as we come to find out, songs have a way of coming from all sorts of places. Some hidden artists like lightning, fast and furious, while others take their time. Now, they linger until they're fully realized. Abracadabra was just like that. It was very slow to develop. Steve had recorded it several times, but the song wasn't working. He was excited about the music, but he didn't want to waste music on words that he thought were lousy. So when he returned home from that memorable day on the slopes with his mind focused on fashioning a Diana Ross and Supremes lyric line, the process of developing the unfinished track went into warp speed. I mean, Steve finished the lyrics for Abracadabra in just a few minutes. Because the music had been brewing for 3 years and he wrote the lyrics in like 10, 15 minutes, Steve joked that Abracadabra took him 3 years and 15 minutes to finish. Now, unlike most of the previous Steve Miller Band LPs, the Abracadabra album wasn't written predominantly by Steve himself. Now, for Abracadabra, the creative reins were shared. Gary Malabar, he had been part of another band called Tracker, which included fellow SMB members John Massaro and Byron Allred, along with ex-members Lonnie Turner and Greg Douglas. It was hoped that one of them would be used for the album. Steve ultimately opted to use all the demos that they submitted, resulting in Gary Malabar receiving an impressive 8 co-writing credits on the record. He also played drums and percussion and co-produced the record. So Abracadabra, the album's title track, was one of only 2 songs on that record that Steve wrote himself. The lyric, round and round and round it goes, where it stops nobody knows, that's a reference to the spinning wheel segment from the original Amateur Hour, a radio and TV program that ran from 1934 to 1945.
Around, around she goes, and where she stops, nobody knows.
On the recording of Abracadabra, Steve Miller performed the vocals and the lead guitar. He also played the digital synclavier synthesizer, along with the Roland Jupiter 8 and the Roland Jupiter 60. Those were the devices that created those unique sounds over the guitar tracks in the song's bridge. So, you know, from Fly Like an Eagle forward, Steve Miller was very experimental with keyboards in the sound synthesizers. Now, I mentioned that Greg Malabar performed drums and percussion. There was also Kenny Lee Lewis laying down the bass parts. Now, Steve thought Abracadabra was what he called a pretty slick piece of music. He was very proud of the way that it turned out. But you know, when he submitted Abracadabra to the top dogs at Capitol Records, guess what? They hated it. They loathed it. Steve actually disclosed that after only a few weeks, the label was ready to give up on the single. The executives told him, "We're not getting any phone reaction and radio doesn't like it at all." So Steve basically told them where to go, and he decided to go to Europe and promote the song. Just so happened that Steve had brokered a different deal with Phonogram Records, internationally anyway, so the marketing campaign for the single was much different overseas. When Steve got to Europe, the song rose to #1 in virtually every country except for the US and Japan. Now, as big as his stature was in the world of rock and roll, Steve Miller was never destined to be a flashy, music video star. Yet, it was critically important for Abracadabra to have a music video that could be played on MTV. This is right when that was happening. Now, without the star power of a charismatic frontman, the video leaned into the magic theme instead. For most of the clip, magicians performed tricks while, Steve Miller played it low-key, making sort of token appearances in sunglasses, playing his guitar and moving in slow motion. The video was directed by Peter Kahn, who was a bit of a pioneer. He was one of the first to integrate computer effects into music videos. The Capitol Record brass couldn't have been more wrong about this song. It's usually the case, right? Abracadabra, like magic, shot to #1 all over the world. Australia, Austria, Canada, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark, West Germany, and eventually spent 2 non-consecutive weeks on the top of the Billboard Hot 100. In the UK, the song just missed the #1 spot. It crested at #2. Now, not only was the song a #1 single, a #1 smash, it had incredible staying power. It sat in the top 10 in America for 14 weeks. Ranked as the 9th biggest single in 1982 in Billboard's year-end countdown. Overall, Abracadabra comes in at number 90 in Billboard Hot 100's 60th anniversary survey, which is pretty awesome. The band Sugar Ray, featuring lead singer Mark McGrath, made a version of Abracadabra in 1998. That one just missed the top 40, stalling at number 43 on the Billboard Hot 100. Their rendition actually performed best in Iceland, where it moved to number 31. There were also covers by Eagles of Death Metal in 2019, and Journey's current lead singer Arnel Pineda. He also remade the song. Then in 2024, Eminem conjured up a little old school magic of his hit track Houdini. The song sparkled with a clever nod to Abracadabra, weaving its enchanting hook in a modern spellbinding rhythm. Back in 1989, Steve Miller was less than thrilled when the Houston rap act The Ghetto Boys sampled the Joker in their song Gangster of Love. He was really critical about how they borrowed his first #1 hit into their music.
Gangster boogie, gangster boogie.
However, when Eminem came knocking, Steve Miller's attitude was as transformed as a rabbit pulled from a hat. Sorry, I got to go with the little magician theme here. Steve enthusiastically handed over the rights to Abracadabra, praising the rapper from St. Joseph, Missouri as a timeless originator.
Guess who's back? Guess who's back? Guess who's back? Guess who's back? Guess who's back?
Eminem's Houdini was a monster hit. It debuted at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 while striking the number 1 spot on the hip-hop chart and in countries all over the globe, just like Abracadabra.
I'm about to reach in my back, bruh.
Actually, Steve Miller caught some flack from the rock community when he released Abracadabra back in the day. Some of his core fans heard it as a commercial sellout. Now, Steve was very candid about it. He said, and I quote, "Abracadabra killed me with a whole bunch of people. There were a lot of artists that were kind of snide about wanting to make hit records. I knew Les Paul since I was 4, and he had 25 hit records or something like that. I think if someone as influential as Les Paul has hits, that should shut everybody up." End of quote. Now, from a chart perspective, Abracadabra was Steve Miller's biggest hit. It was the 3rd number 1 single of his career following The Joker in '73 and Rockin' Me in '76.
I'm a joker, I'm a smoker, rockin' me, baby, 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 keep on rockin'.
But it was the only Steve Miller song that hit the top of the singles chart for 2 weeks. It was also the last time that a Steve Miller song broke the top 40. Strangely enough, this is the strange part of this episode. Steve Miller had one of the biggest songs of the early 80s. He was excited that it would push him back to the top in the middle of the new wave and MTV generation. His concert attendance had declined, but this number 1 hit would surely take him back to selling out arenas, right? His box office, it wasn't matching the song's popularity. Even with the song dominating radio, it couldn't fill arenas for Miller. He was falling out of favor. He said, and I quote, "We were considered a dinosaur group. Punk was in, new wave, the hair bands, the guys in the green tights and 2-foot hairdos. It seemed at the time that our run was really over." So as the box office cooled off for Steve Miller Band, Steve was perplexed for a bit. Then he decided, you know what, I'm just going to take some time off from touring. He actually bought a boat. He named it Abracadabra. And he spent most of the next 6 years cruising up and down the inside passage between Seattle and Alaska, just fishing on the boat that he named after his final hit single. But then a funny thing happened. After 6 years of staying away from the stage, Steve was bored to tears. He couldn't resist the urge to get back after it. And so when he returned to the concert circuit, which he was a little scared to do, in '89 going into the '90s, to his surprise, he found that his stock had risen substantially. Enough time had passed, and the format of classic rock had been invented, with radio stations playing only the classics of rock across the nation. Turns out people wanted to see these bands live. So Miller was back to selling out large venues. Since his comeback, he's remained a hot ticket ever since, playing 50 shows a year. Now, Miller had 9 hits from 1973 to 1982, 6 of those that are played all the time on classic rock radio. He has just become a staple artist of that. Steve Miller, now a Hall of Famer, is an elderly statesman in the rock world. He has more appreciation for Abracadabra than ever before. It's an enduring favorite, with playful sexual innuendo and catchy, simplistic June Moon spoon-like vocal cadence. One of the highlights of the track is Steve Miller's guitar wizardry. Enhanced by the modern recording devices of the day, we still hear the magic in that section of Steve's creation. It ended up as one of the biggest hits to break before Michael Jackson's Thriller started to dominate in '83 to '84. And you know what? The fans still love Abracadabra. Every time he and his band play it, it gets a roaring standing ovation, and it may be the craftiest rhyme of its time, right? I'm sure Steve was wondering, how the hell am I going to find a word that's going to rhyme with abracadabra? Well, reach out and grab you? That's good enough. Leave us a comment about Steve Miller, Van. Steve Miller. What are your memories of Abracadabra, of the music video? I tell you what, I just think it's so amazing. Thinks his career's over, spends 6 years away, comes back, and he's bigger than he was before. The power of rock and roll, great music. Let's have a good discussion. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe. Love to have you as part of our community. Till next time, 3 quarts and the truth.